First contact confusion. The research vessel Celestial Whisper hung motionless in Earth's orbit, its crystalline observation dome filled with increasingly agitated aliens. Senior researcher Vexne's translucent tentacles rippled with confusion patterns as she studied the readings for the seventh time. Impossible, she chittered to her research team. The instruments must be malfunctioning. No species could survive these temperature variations. Below them, the Arctic Circle stretched vast and white. Their sensors showed temperatures far below freezing, winds that could strip flesh from bone, and a barren landscape that should be uninhabitable. Yet their scanners kept detecting clusters of biological signatures moving across the surface. Magnification increase, Vexne ordered. The view zoomed in, revealing something that made her chromatic spots flash with shock. Humans, dozens of them. Not huddling in protective shelters or fighting for survival, but playing. They watched as humans glided down snow-covered slopes on primitive boards, their bodies wrapped in what appeared to be laughably thin protective layers. Others were creating geometric patterns in the snow, lying down and moving their limbs in synchronized motions. A smaller group had carved a hole in a frozen body of water and were voluntarily submerging themselves in the frigid liquid. Are they being punished? Junior researcher Zeltor asked, his voice trembling. Is this some form of extreme criminal rehabilitation? Negative. Their cultural analyst, Mirakos, responded. According to the intercepted communications, this is called winter vacation. They appear to be engaging in recreational activities. The research team fell into stunned silence. Their own species required carefully regulated environmental chambers to maintain their delicate cellular structure. Temperature variations of even a few degrees could cause severe systemic shock. Yet here were humans, deliberately exposing themselves to conditions that should be lethal. Look at their young, Vexne exclaimed as their scanners focused on a group of small humans engaged in throwing compressed spheres of frozen water at each other. They're allowing their offspring to participate in these extreme conditions. The team watched in horror as a human child fell face first into the snow, only to emerge laughing, their body temperature barely affected by the contact with the frozen substance. Their biological readings are fascinating, Mirakos noted, analyzing the data streams. Their bodies actively generate heat to compensate for the environmental conditions. They possess internal temperature regulation that far exceeds anything in our database. But the energy requirements, Zeltor began. They're consuming frozen flavored water on sticks. Mirakos interrupted, her voice filled with disbelief, while standing in sub-zero temperatures. For pleasure. Vexne's decision crystals pulsed with determination. This required immediate attention from the Galactic Scientific Council. Any species that could not only survive but actively seek enjoyment in such extreme conditions needed careful study. She was preparing to send her preliminary report when the sensors detected something even more alarming. A group of humans were preparing to spend the night in shelters made entirely of compressed snow. They sleep in frozen water structures, she noted in her report, her appendages trembling as she recorded the observation. They have turned one of the most hostile environments we have encountered into a recreational destination. This goes beyond simple adaptation. These humans don't just survive extremes, they deliberately seek them out. As the Celestial Whisper continued its observation, more incredible data poured in. Humans creating temporary settlements on frozen lakes. Humans propelling themselves across the snow using primitive wooden extensions attached to their feet. Humans teaching their young to slide down ice-covered slopes at dangerous velocities. Add a priority tag to the report, Vexne instructed. Classification. Potential extreme environment specialists. Note, their response to what we consider lethal conditions appears to be enthusiasm. The report was transmitted across the galaxy, carrying with it the first warning signs that humanity might be something unprecedented in the cosmic community, not because of their technology, which was relatively primitive, but because of their inexplicable ability to turn death-dealing environments into playgrounds. As night fell over the Arctic, the research team watched the humans gather around controlled combustion events they called bonfires, sharing heated beverages and engaging in social bonding, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were casually defying what most species would consider certain death. Should we attempt contact? Zeltor asked. Vexna's pattern spots flickered with uncertainty. Not yet. We need to understand more about their environmental adaptation capabilities. Mark this region for extended study, and let's move to their equatorial zones. I want to know if their temperature resistance extends to the other extreme. The celestial whisper slowly moved to new coordinates, leaving behind humans who continued their winter festivities, blissfully unaware that they had just been classified as one of the most resilient, and therefore potentially concerning, species in the known galaxy. In her private log, Vexna added one final note: most species adapt to survive. These humans appear to adapt for fun. The implications are unsettling. The coffee incident. The Galactic Scientific Council's first official meeting with human representatives was proceeding exactly as senior researcher Vexna had feared, with chaos. She watched through her protective field as the human delegation casually sipped from containers of a steaming dark liquid, her sensor implants screaming warnings about the substance's chemical composition. Ambassador Chen. She began carefully, her translation matrix struggling to maintain composure. Are you aware that you're consuming a highly toxic stimulant? The human ambassador looked down at her coffee cup with mild surprise. Oh, it's just my morning coffee. Would you like some? We brought enough to share. The entire alien delegation recoiled in horror, their protective fields intensifying automatically. Vexna's research assistant, Zeltor, was already frantically updating their species threat assessment database. That beverage, Miracos, their xenobiologist, interjected, contains enough stimulants to cause cardiac arrest in 82% of known sentient species. Our scans indicate you've already consumed 3 containers of it. Ambassador Chen smiled apologetically. Sorry about that. It's been a long morning. Usually I drink more, but I tried to cut back for the meeting. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of environmental systems and the quiet slurp as another human delegate finished their cup. Vexna's pattern spots were cycling through colors so rapidly she was starting to feel dizzy. More? The human asked, reaching for what they called a coffee pot. The alien delegation watched in mute horror as she poured another cup of the lethal brew. Please, Vexna managed, her translator struggling to convey the mix of scientific fascination and terror in her voice. Explain the purpose of consuming this toxin. Well, Ambassador Chen considered, taking another sip, it helps us wake up in the morning. Improves focus. Some of us just enjoy the taste. Plus, the caffeine gives a nice little energy boost. Energy boost? Zeltor's voice cracked. You deliberately consume neural stimulants for increased energy output. Sure, another human delegate chimed in. Some of us even have energy drinks when coffee isn't strong enough. Those have taurine too. The alien delegation's collective horror peaked as their database updated with information about these energy drinks. Vexna made a mental note to classify the entire beverage category as a potential chemical weapon. But how did your species even survive discovering these substances? Miracos asked, genuinely curious. Our historical records show that most species that encountered caffeine-bearing plants suffered massive casualties before learning to avoid them. Ambassador Chen shrugged, a gesture that the aliens had learned meant casual dismissal of their concerns. Trial and error, I suppose, though there's some evidence our ancestors evolved alongside coffee plants. We've been drinking it for thousands of years. Evolved, alongside. Vexna's translator actually glitched trying to process the implications. A species that not only survived contact with toxic plants, but developed a symbiotic relationship with them. The meeting was temporarily suspended when one of the human delegates pulled out something they called a chocolate espresso bar, and the alien security team insisted on evacuating the chamber for emergency decontamination. Later, in her private research notes, Vexna added, "Human biochemistry continues to defy our understanding. They have not only developed immunity to substances that would be lethal to most species, but they actively seek them out for pleasure and enhanced performance. Their morning ritual involves voluntarily consuming doses of stimulants that would be considered chemical weapons on most worlds. Most disturbing of all, they seem genuinely puzzled by our concern." She watched through the observation window as the human delegation gathered in their break room, casually sharing what her sensors identified as theobromine-laced confections and discussing plans for something called a coffee shop in the future Joint Species Embassy. Additional note, she added to her report, humans appear to have built an entire cultural ritual around the consumption of their favorite toxins. They not only survive what should kill them, they celebrate it. Request immediate review of all planned diplomatic dinner menus. We cannot assume that what is safe for them will not be lethal to others. The implications were staggering. A species that could consume poison for pleasure might be capable of surviving anything. And they wanted to share these substances with other species out of hospitality. Final note, Vexna concluded, perhaps the most concerning aspect is not their immunity to these toxins, but their enthusiasm for sharing them. They genuinely cannot comprehend why other species might find their casual relationship with lethal substances disturbing. To them, this is not an adaptation. This is simply breakfast. As she finished her report, she could hear the humans in the distance, discussing something called a coffee break. Apparently, they required regular doses of their chosen stimulant throughout the day to maintain optimal function. The galaxy, she realized, was not prepared for a species that had turned poison into a dietary staple. Through the observation window, Ambassador Chen raised her cup in a friendly gesture toward the alien researchers, completely unaware that she had just single-handedly caused the revision of 3 different galactic safety protocols and the creation of an entirely new category in the Xenobiological Threat Assessment Database. Substances harmless to humans but lethal to everyone else. The Survival Games. This is a sporting event. Senior researcher Vexna asked for the 3rd time, her pattern spots pulsing with disbelief as she watched the mass of humans gathered at the starting line of what they called the marathon. Ambassador Chen nodded enthusiastically. One of our oldest and most respected traditions. 42 kilometers of pure endurance running. The alien delegation huddled closer together in their protective fields, their sensory appendages twitching as they processed this information. They had been invited to observe what humans called the Olympic Games, but nothing in their preparation had readied them for this. And they do this voluntarily? Miracos asked, her xenobiological sensors working overtime to analyze the participants' vital signs. People train for years for the chance to compete, Chen explained. Some even pay for the privilege in smaller regional events. Zeltor, who had been quietly updating their species assessment database, suddenly emitted a high-pitched whistle of alarm. According to our calculations, the average participant will lose approximately 2 liters of water through perspiration during this event. Oh, more than that in this heat, Chen said casually. That's why we have hydration stations set up along the route. The alien researchers watched in horrified fascination as the race began. Thousands of humans willingly subjecting themselves to prolonged physical stress, extreme fluid loss, and potential cardiac strain, all in the name of sport. But what about the mountain climbing event? Vexna asked, referring to another Olympic sport they'd observed. Surely that must be simulated. Chen laughed. No, that's real too. Though if you think the Olympic climbing is impressive, you should see what people do on Everest for fun. The resulting explanation of recreational mountain climbing caused 3 junior researchers to require immediate therapeutic stasis. The concept of humans deliberately ascending to heights where oxygen became scarce, temperatures dropped to lethal levels, and their bodies began to literally die, for entertainment, was almost too much to process. And this is considered normal. Miracos asked weakly. Well, extreme sports aren't for everyone, Chen admitted. Some people prefer less intense activities, like ultramarathons or freediving. The alien delegation's collective horror peaked as they learned about humans who swam to crushing depths without protective equipment, who jumped from high altitudes with only thin fabric to slow their descent, who climbed frozen waterfalls for pleasure. Ambassador Vexna said carefully, "Our species assessment protocols require us to ask, are these activities part of some cultural death ritual?" Chen blinked in surprise. Death ritual? No. These are just hobbies, ways to challenge ourselves, push our limits, you know. That was exactly what worried them. The humans weren't just surviving adversity. They were actively seeking it out, treating lethal conditions as personal challenges to overcome. Later, in a secure conference room, the alien delegation held an emergency meeting. The implications are staggering, Vexna began. We're not just dealing with a species that can survive extreme conditions. We're dealing with a species that deliberately creates challenges to test their survival capabilities. For recreation, Miracos added, her voice trembling. They do it for fun. The psychological assessment team is particularly concerned, Zeltor reported. The humans appear to have something they call an achievement mindset. When told something is impossible, they interpret it as a challenge. The meeting was interrupted by excited shouts from the observation deck. A human had just broken the previous marathon record, their vital signs showing stress levels that should have induced system failure in most species. They watched as the victor was celebrated, despite showing clear signs of physical distress. More disturbing still, other humans expressed envy and a desire to beat the new record. Add to the official report, Vexna dictated. Humans exhibit a unique psychological trait. They appear to derive satisfaction from activities that should trigger survival panic responses. They have turned the very concept of survival into a recreational activity. Through the window, they could see Ambassador Chen chatting with some of the athletes, apparently discussing something called extreme ironing, a sport whose explanation would later cause the entire Xenological Recreation Research Department to request stress leave. One final note, Vexna added. Traditional threat assessment protocols may be insufficient for this species. How do you evaluate the danger posed by beings who voluntarily exceed their own survival limits as a form of entertainment, who treat lethal conditions as desirable challenges? As she finished her report, a junior researcher rushed in with news that humans were organizing something called an ultramarathon in the Sahara Desert. The alien delegation collectively decided that some information was better left unshared with the Galactic Council. There were some aspects of human recreation that the wider galaxy simply wasn't ready to comprehend. The emergency. The alarms on Unity Station screamed through every corridor, their urgent wailing accompanied by flashing red lights. Senior researcher Vexna's protective field crackled with anxiety as she monitored the emergency from the station's backup control center. Status report, she demanded, her translator barely keeping up with her agitated clicks. Primary reactor containment breach, Zeltor reported, his patterns showing extreme distress. Station's radiation shielding is failing. Environmental systems are cascading toward shutdown. The Joint Human Galactic Research Station, humanity's first major collaborative project with the wider galaxy, was experiencing what the design team had classified as a catastrophic impossibility. Multiple redundant systems were failing simultaneously. Where are the humans? Miracos asked, frantically scanning through camera feeds. Still in the reactor section, Zeltor replied. They refused to evacuate. The alien staff had already retreated to their emergency shelters, their bodies far too sensitive to risk exposure to the increasing radiation and temperature fluctuations. But the human engineering team, led by Chief Engineer Sarah Connor, had done the unthinkable. They'd moved toward the danger. Through the monitoring systems, they watched as the humans worked in conditions that should have been instantly lethal. The reactor chamber's radiation levels were soaring, The temperature was climbing past the boiling point of water, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. Chief Connor, Vexna called through the emergency channel. Your environmental suits weren't designed for these conditions. You must evacuate immediately. Can't do that. Connor's voice crackled back, eerily calm. If this reactor goes, we lose the whole station. Besides, suits are holding up fine. Just a bit warm in here. The aliens watched in horror as the human team manually vented plasma from the damaged reactor, their bodies absorbing radiation doses that the medical database insisted should be fatal. One human suit was visibly damaged, yet they continued working, seemingly unconcerned about the exposure to conditions that would liquefy most species' internal organs. They're using their bodies as radiation shields, Miracos whispered, her scientific detachment cracking. They're physically blocking the radiation to protect sensitive equipment. Impossible, Zeltor muttered, but the sensor readings were clear. The humans were not just surviving in conditions that defied their own safety protocols. They were actively working, problem-solving, and even making jokes about the situation. Hey Vex, Connor's voice came through again, now sounding slightly strained. Remember how you said humans were crazy for drinking coffee? Well, what I wouldn't give for a cup right now. Anyone want to make a coffee run? The fact that she could joke while standing in what was essentially a solar flare made Vexna's pattern spots shrobe with disbelief. Hours passed. The human team worked tirelessly, their vital signs showing extreme stress, but nowhere near the systemic failure that the medical eye kept predicting. They'd rotated out only when their suit power cells needed charging, each taking minimal rest before returning to the lethal environment. Finally, Connor's voice came through again. Reactor contained. We're starting emergency repairs now. Should have main power back in a few hours. The alien staff emerged from their shelters to find the humans already starting the cleanup, their bodies showing signs of severe radiation exposure, but their spirits seemingly unaffected. The station's medical bay was quickly overwhelmed, not by the number of casualties, but by the humans' refusal to accept mandatory recovery periods. You absorbed enough radiation to kill a Centaurian stone beast, the medical officer complained to Connor, who was already trying to leave her bed. You need at least a month of intensive treatment. Just give me some anti-rad meds and a coffee, Connor argued. I've got a reactor to fix. Later, in her emergency report to the Galactic Council, Vexna struggled to find words to explain what she had witnessed. The humans' response to lethal conditions continues to defy our understanding, she wrote. When faced with radiation levels that should have rendered them immediately unconscious, they not only remained functional but exhibited complex problem-solving abilities. They treated their own potential death as an acceptable risk in exchange for saving shared infrastructure. She added a personal note. Most concerning is their apparent inability to recognize the extraordinary nature of their actions. When congratulated on their heroic survival, they dismissed it as just doing their jobs. One engineer suggested that the experience was good practice for future emergencies. The incident would later be cited in dozens of xenobiology papers, each trying to explain how humans could survive conditions that violated fundamental biological laws. But perhaps the most telling detail was what happened immediately after the crisis. The humans organized a party, celebrating their survival with more of their toxic beverages, while already planning improvements to make the reactor safer by their own impossible standards. The understanding. The Galactic Council's emergency session hummed with nervous energy as senior researcher Vexna prepared to present her final assessment of humanity. Her pattern spots had settled into a deep, thoughtful blue as she organized her findings from months of observation. Honored council members, she began, her translator perfectly modulated. I stand before you to discuss what may be the most remarkable species we have ever encountered, though not for the reasons we initially thought. The chamber's crystalline walls reflected the concerned faces of 1,000 different species as holographic displays showed scenes from her research. Humans playing in Arctic conditions, casually consuming toxic substances, participating in their survival games, and most recently, their impossible performance during the Unity Station crisis. When we first discovered humans, we thought we had found a species of survivors, beings who had evolved to endure what we considered impossible conditions. We were wrong. She paused, letting that sink in. They are not survivors. They are pioneers. The displays showed new footage. Humans planning settlements in the Martian desert, designing deep-sea habitats, sketching out plans for terraforming Venus. Most species, she continued, evolve to fit their environment. Humans alter their environment to suit themselves, and when they can't, they adapt themselves not just to survive, but to thrive. They don't merely endure challenges, they actively seek them out. Ambassador Chen stood calmly in the observation gallery, sipping her coffee, apparently unconcerned that the simple act was causing several council members to emit distress pheromones. Their adaptability goes beyond physical resilience, Vexna explained. When faced with lethal radiation at Unity Station, they didn't just survive. They invented new safety protocols while exposed to conditions that should have killed them. They used their own bodies as radiation shields while discussing equipment improvements. The council chamber filled with murmurs as she displayed the medical readings from the Unity Station incident. But perhaps most remarkable is their psychological response to what we consider existential threats. They don't experience appropriate fear responses. Instead, they exhibit what they call curiosity and excitement when confronting new challenges. She brought up new data, plans for human expansion, their proposed modifications to existing technology, their casual discussion of colonizing worlds that most species consider death zones. We must understand something fundamental about humans, Vexna stressed. They don't think like a species that evolved on a death world. They don't consider Earth particularly dangerous. To them, their home world is perfect, comfortable, even. This means that what they consider challenging or extreme defies our comprehension. The chamber erupted in concerned chittering as she displayed humanity's plans for deep space exploration, including casual references to hibernation technology and multi-generation ships, as if the concepts weren't terrifying. My final recommendation may surprise you, Vexna continued once the chamber quieted. Despite their potentially threatening capabilities, I do not recommend any restrictions on human expansion or development. The shock in the chamber was palpable. She raised a calming appendage. Let me explain. Humans don't want to conquer the galaxy. They want to explore it. They don't wish to harm other species. They want to help them. Their seemingly reckless disregard for danger comes with an equally powerful drive to protect and assist others. She showed footage of human rescue workers running into burning buildings, of their doctors treating deadly diseases, of their engineers working in lethal conditions to save others. Yes, they are dangerous, she acknowledged, but not in the way we feared. They're dangerous because they make the impossible seem achievable. They're dangerous because they look at a lethal environment and see a future garden. They're dangerous because they might convince other species to dream bigger, reach further, try harder. In the observation gallery, Ambassador Chen had been joined by Chief Engineer Connor, both now drinking coffee and watching the proceedings with interest. My final conclusion is this. Humanity's greatest asset isn't their physical resilience or their ability to survive extreme conditions. It's their inability to accept limitations, both their own and others. They don't believe in insurmountable obstacles. They don't recognize impossible as a valid category. She displayed one final image. Human children playing in a garden on Unity Station, their laughter mixing with the hum of radiation shielding that their parents had improved after the crisis. We can try to contain them, restrict them, limit them, and we will fail. Instead, I propose we do something unprecedented. We learn from them, not their technology or their methods, but their perspective. Perhaps the galaxy needs a species that looks at deadly radiation and sees a power source, that views toxic environments as places to explore, that treats survival not as a goal, but as a starting point. The council chamber was silent as her words sank in. In the gallery, Chen and Connor had been joined by other humans, all casually drinking their various toxic beverages, all watching with that peculiar expression that Vexna had learned to recognize as optimistic curiosity. They will change the galaxy, she concluded, not through conquest or competition, but by simply being who they are, a species that doesn't understand that they should not be able to do the things they do. And perhaps that is exactly what the galaxy needs. As the council began their deliberations, Vexna added one final note to her personal log. The most remarkable thing about humans isn't that they beat impossible odds. It's that they don't believe in impossible odds to begin with, and somehow that makes them more incredible than any amount of physical resilience ever could.